Gauteng Premier David Makhura welcomes the African Development Bank. This is a day before the AFDB announces its plans to usher in investments for the continent. The African Development Bank will be announcing a bold new initiative, the Africa Investment Forum, that will play a significant role in plugging Africa's infrastructure gap, estimated as wide as $170 billion a year. At the Michelangelo Hotel in Sandton, Johannesburg, Premier Makhura shares a joke or two with the African Development President, Akinwumi Adesina.
We are looking forward to this event in November. We have worked very hard to convince the African Development Bank that this is the right place to host the Africa Investment Forum. We have put together a great team that's going to be working with the bank to make sure that this forum is a great success.
The African Development Bank's President Adesina makes a few stops ahead of the big announcement. The first is South Africa's National Treasury to meet with the recently appointed Finance Minister, Nhlanhla Nene. Next, the President visits the African Development Bank's Southern Africa Resource Center. The final stop for the day is at the Sexton Hotel for a dinner with some stakeholders.
Great to see my brother Dlamini. He's here, and we met actually during the Africa CEO Forum, and it's great to continue that conversation. It's nice to also see, right here, Rakesh Rahi. We were with him with the CNBC Africa. Doing an interview tonight with Brownie, who, of course, you all know. She is fantastic. I've never seen anybody that actually does interviews on television with so much energy, dynamism. It's just effusing all the time. And it's really great to see you. And I can tell you, she when we launched the high fives of the bank, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, very cold Davos. It was actually Brownie that actually, and Mr. Rakesh, who actually helped us to launch that just when I became president. So we thank you very much for that partnership and helping us to do that.
Sure enough, as the African Development Bank takes another leap of faith in launching the Africa Investment Forum, it is Bronwyn Nielsen and CNBC Africa that assists in the journey.
CNBC Africa has had the pleasure of interviewing President Adesina for many, many years, first in his capacity as the Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, and since September 2015 as the President of the African Development Bank. Over that 8-year period, what CNBC Africa can emphatically tell you is that this is a man who is true to a word. He generally sets a vision and then he executes on it. And in Davos earlier this year, he did exactly that in his CNBC Africa interview. Dr. and President Adesina sat down and spoke of the Africa Investment Forum and the imminent launch. And ladies and gentlemen, here we are today at the inaugural launch. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome to the podium Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank.
I know you like vuvuzelas in South Africa, and I hope that from here we can hand the sounds of many vuvuzelas out to Africa on investment. I would like to thank in particular His Excellency President Cyril Ramaphosa and his government for their strong support for the African Development Bank and their commitment to the need for accelerated development in Africa. The time for that is here, and a time for which we need game changers. I am here to tell you what is probably the most important game-changing investment initiative for accelerated economic development undertaken in Africa. It is called the Africa Investment Forum. It's a unique platform for investment, finance, transparent transactions, and a genuine African marketplace for closing deals to accelerate the economic development of Africa. But first, let me set the scene. Though faced with quite a number of obvious challenges, Africa is growing economically resilient. On multiple levels, we are swimming with a fast-moving current of global finance, trade, and economic growth. But we must go faster. And why? We have much ground to cover, and the world is not standing still. With an eye on a future that is already upon us, we must scan the horizon. Today, Africa has a population of 1.2 billion people. By 2050, just 32 short years from now, our growing population will tip the scales to a whopping 2 billion people. In the process, we will overtake the populations of China and India combined together. That is a huge asset for Africa and an asset that we must unlock. Think about it. By 2030, the combined consumer demand and business spending in Africa are expected to reach $6.7 trillion US. Again, our task is how to fully unlock these potentials. Ultimately, however, leadership is about anticipating the future long before it arrives. We have no other choice than to act in the now and turn our challenges into opportunities that will benefit generations yet to come. Therefore, if Africa is to achieve a genuine, equitable, and sustainable economic transformation, it cannot be by business as usual. It must be business unusual. To start with, Africa's infrastructure financing needs are estimated to be between 130 and 170 billion US dollars per year. However, total commitments came to just about $63 billion in 2016. As it has been for decades, national governments are still the main providers of infrastructure finance in Africa. This represents a financing gap of approximately 67 to 107 billion US dollars in just infrastructure alone. But the overall investment gap for Africa to achieve overall economic development is actually much higher and stands at $200 billion to $1.2 trillion a year. These are definitely huge numbers, but I'm not scared of big numbers anyway, because our populations are growing very, very fast, and we must act very quickly. The fact is, however, no individual benefactor, no matter how rich, or government, or sovereign wealth fund, or even a multilateral development bank for that matter, can provide the resources to meet Africa's critical economic development needs. While the African Development Bank and many other multilateral partners and donors are making significant contributions, this still does not close that gap. But Africa can, and Africa must do so. First, each year, Africa collects $500 billion in tax revenues, $60 billion in foreign direct investment, $50 billion in foreign aid, $60 billion in remittances, and the numbers are improving. Within Africa, the assets under management of domestic institutional investors will rise to $1.8 trillion by 2020, tripling from the current $634 billion. Most of this money, however, isn't invested in Africa. But Africa should invest in its own development if it wants others to do so. It is a tall order, but the money is certainly there and available globally. By 2020, there will be close to 111 trillion US dollars of assets under management globally that are invested around the world, often, as you know, at very low interest rates. Our task is to leverage a significant share of these savings into Africa's economic development. Financing Africa's development has to be a collective and cooperative task, requiring broad partnerships with the private sector and an appreciation of the realities of global investment patterns. It may sound like a cliche, but it certainly is not. The good news is that Africa is the next investment frontier. But we need to bridge the gap between available capital and bankable projects. Problems that hinder closure for potentially bankable projects must be resolved in new win-win arrangements for the private sector, investment equity funds, development finance institutions, the public sector, and other relevant stakeholders. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the essential reason for the Africa Investment Forum, a multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary platform that will bring together collaborative leadership for the purpose of creatively and strategically transforming economic and social development in Africa. The Africa Investment Forum will provide an open platform to organize efforts among multilateral institutions, the private sector, and governments to improve a pipeline of projects capable of transforming this beautiful continent. In short, the Africa Investment Forum will be an Africa investment marketplace where the African Development Bank and its partners will screen and enhance bankable projects, attract co-investors, and facilitate transactions to close Africa's investment gaps. This unprecedented platform will reduce intermediation costs, improve the quality of project information and documentation, and increase active and productive engagements between African governments and the private sector. Preparatory work on these engagements has already begun and will continue throughout the year. This first ever Africa Investment Forum will be held 7th to 9th of November right here in Johannesburg, South Africa. It is not a one-time event, just to be sure. It will be a permanent platform that will help fast-track the implementation of commitments from previous fora. There will be 5 work streams. You know, I like 5 things. The project preparation stream will work closely with Africa 50, the Infrastructure Consortium for Africa, and the NEPAD Infrastructure Project Preparation Facility, among others, in order to scale up project preparation facilities and tools. The second work stream, pipeline development, will help to develop investment-ready projects sourced by the African Development Bank and the external development finance partners. The third one, the risk mitigation and credit enhancement work stream, will include a co-guarantee platform that will help to develop and deploy innovative risk-sharing instruments that will help to take private sector investments to scale. This platform and this facility lies at the heart of the Africa Investment Forum, and I must tell you, this is the first time that in the multilateral development finance community that all of us, we have ourselves, African Development Bank, we have the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we have the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, we have the Islamic Development Bank, we also have the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. We are all on the same platform. The first time that has happened anywhere in the world. So this tells you that we're talking big stuff here with regard to Africa. Another work stream, of course, will bring together all these global and domestic global investors to examine, encourage, and promote appropriate investments in Africa. And finally, the Africa Investment Forum will focus on improving the ease of doing business in Africa by advancing and promoting investment-friendly regulations and also championing ethical business practices in Africa. We are using strategic alliances and partnerships to remove well-known obstacles to finance, especially those created by false perception that investment in Africa is somehow more risky than comparable investments elsewhere. We must ensure that African companies can compete fairly and are able to secure adequate and appropriate funding for their operations. For this, we must counter these false perceptions with simple truths. Governments, development finance institutions, and the private sector are thinking and acting in new and innovative ways and well beyond traditional bank lending. Several multilateral development banks will be joining us, as I said, to accelerate private investment at this event, creating a new stream or mainstream of development financing.
We as the Gauteng provincial government are very pleased to have won the bid to host this biggest and quite incomparable investment platform on the African continent. I want to emphasize we won the bid. We didn't get this through favor. We won the bid. We put a very strong bid to host the Africa Investment Forum, and we demonstrated our strong credentials, firstly as a major proponent of the African economic integration, and a key driver of Africa's industrialization and inter-Africa trade. Gauteng province contributes 35% to South Africa's GDP and between 8 to 10% to the total GDP of our continent. Undoubtedly, we are the industrial hub and the manufacturing workshop of sub-Saharan Africa. And with regard to finances and financial markets, Johannesburg is Africa's financial nerve center. We have the state-of-the-art infrastructure, a sound and investor-friendly regulatory environment underpinned by a very strong and efficient Gauteng Investment Center, which serves as our one-stop shop for fast-tracking applications and improving the ease of doing business in our province. Gauteng province also accounts for 71% of South Africa's investments in the different regions of our continent. Gauteng-based companies have invested more than $30 billion in different regions of our continent. As a provincial government, we work very closely in partnership with different regional and state governments across our continent. With regard to infrastructure, we have an infrastructure master plan, 15-year infrastructure master plan, with a portfolio of bankable projects that require more than $150 billion over 10 years. I want to emphasize, Mr. President, not in 1 year, over 10 years. It is for this reason that as the provincial government, we take the opportunity to convey our heartfelt gratitude to President Adesina and the team from the African Development Bank for giving us this unique opportunity to host Africa's first of its kind investment platform. It is an honor to receive a vote of confidence from one of the most influential, respected, and credible institutions of our continent, the AFDB. I want to assure the AFDB and all investors and business people who are with us here and those who are still to come to the forum in November that we are ready to host this groundbreaking investment platform for our continent. We have an impeccable track record in hosting continental and global events of the magnitude and significance represented by the Africa Investment Forum. We are a government that upholds ethical leadership and promotes good governance as the cornerstone of development, without which we can get nowhere. So your trust in us is not misplaced. We have the full support of our national government and municipalities in our province who are working together with us to prepare for the Africa Investment Forum. And we work through the Gauteng Investment Center to attract foreign direct investment in our country, in our province, and in the various cities of our province. So the Africa Investment Forum comes to South Africa at a very interesting era in the period of our country, and that is a period of renewed hope and optimism. So, Mr. President, you just chose the right time to bring an investment forum of this magnitude to South Africa. Our country is back on track. Public sentiment is very positive, and investor confidence is rising. And as I said during the State of the Province address, that our people can dream again. They can dream again of a better life and a better Africa. Our brand new president, His Excellency, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, has made investment, an inclusive economy, and good governance the cornerstones of his presidency. He has set a target of attracting $100 billion into the South African economy over a very short space of time. So what a timing. Because I think, looking at the Africa Investment Forum, he can realize his goal just before the completion of 1 year, in November. He has also appointed a powerful team of investment envoys to lead these investment initiatives, to go to different parts of the world and talk to investors and business people, to bring investment to South Africa, but to bring investment to Africa. So the November inaugural Africa Investment Forum fits very well with the investment drive that is led by our president. And this platform will be one of the most important for our government at a national, provincial, and local level, as well as businesses in our country, South Africa, and in the continent. The Investment Forum is the Davos of Africa, and it should be the Davos of Africa. Yes, Mr. President, it should be no talk shop, and rather should become a transaction shop, if ever it must be a shop. And it is a great platform to translate Africa's professed potential into real opportunity and progress. The matter of Africa's prospects and potential is discussed all the time, and once and for all, it must be settled. Africa's potential as an investment destination is articulated well by the World Economic Forum in a recent article, and I quote, "Africa holds enormous potential for private investors. Since the turn of the millennium, it has been among the world's fastest growing regions. Although growth in some parts of Africa is fragile for the moment, the continent has an improving business environment, expanding internet connectivity, rising incomes, and shifting consumption patterns. These enduring trends have created an abundance of commercial opportunities across the continent, transforming it into a market and an opportunity that investors cannot afford to ignore," close quote. Mr. President, it is now time to turn Africa's potential into real progress that can be measured in the improvements in the quality of life and well-being of African populations across the continent, and indeed the diaspora. As you said last night at the dinner we hosted, Mr. President, people cannot eat potential. They need real food on the table. I know for sure investors cannot be happy just with potential. Investors need good returns. The youth and the women in our continent need real business opportunities, and they need real jobs. But for this to happen, Africa needs to move from aid to investment. And I believe Africa is ready for major investment as will be offered at the Africa Investment Forum. We as South Africans say South Africa is open for business again. And as Gauteng Province, we are ready to host the Africa Investment Forum on behalf not only of South Africa, but on behalf of Africa.
Stay tuned for more after the break. Welcome back to the CNBC Africa special, where the African Development Bank is launching a bold initiative in bringing in investments into the continent.
The African train has left the station, and you need to find a way to get on board or risk being left very far behind. On that note, I would like to point to Jaco Marie, So I'm sure you didn't expect this, but we are going to get a roving mic to Jacko Maree. Of course, he is former head of the Standard Bank Group and current chairman of Liberty. He's also one of the special investment envoys that President Cyril Ramaphosa has appointed to garner that $1 trillion investment over the next 5 years. And Jacko, I think it would be appropriate for you to say a couple of words at this juncture, given the enthusiasm around the Africa Investment Forum.
Well, thank you, Bronwyn, and President Adesina and Premier Makura. Great to be here. I can only endorse what's been said. I think this is an incredible initiative, long overdue, and having a focus on investment in Africa is clearly so critical, as we all know. And I think it fits in very neatly with what we, as the special envoys for the President here, are trying to achieve within South Africa. It's Bronwyn, it's £1 trillion, not a trillion.
£1 trillion. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to put that target too enormous. You must have had a heart attack there, Jacko.
Over 5 years, but it's a subcomponent of what you're trying to do, and I think the initiatives that we'll be launching will dovetail very nicely, and we're incredibly supportive of this initiative of yours. So well done, and we look to ride on your coattails and to also assist where we can. Thank you very much.
So, Jacko, I hope that President Cyril Ramaphosa doesn't take a cue from that and up your targets to that number. My apologies if I've given you an enormous headache. I'd also like to hear from Tsepo Mahluwe, who is the CEO of Harith, who's also had an engagement with the African Development Bank, and perhaps can just highlight his experience with the group. Tsepo.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity, Bronwyn. I think from my point of view, what I just like to point out is that just, in 2006, when we set out to create an infrastructure fund focusing on the continent, one of the biggest multilaterals told us it couldn't be done. And it was the FDB which took us around over 10 countries on the continent, which resulted in us, also with the support of an entity like GPF, raising over $600 million. And out of that, I could affirm into the FDB's, President Adesina's involvement in some of the signature projects we've been able to do on the continent, in the form of, Lake Turkana in Kenya, the largest renewable project on the continent with 320 megawatts. As I told you, last week we managed one of the investments we involved in, which is Azura in Nigeria, which you're very much well aware of, closed, within 8 months of target, and close to $900 million project. And also on the back of that, I'd like to say, after 10 years or 12 years in this, we've now together with, our AFC created one of the largest IPP on the continent with 1.8 gigawatts of power is under management. So we know what what partnering with AFDB has done in terms of being able to unlock that potential, and we think that this, talking deals or transaction is the language that we're very much looking forward to. Thank you.
So we're now going to take a Q&A from the audience. If you could observe the following protocol, please put your hand up. We will deploy a roving mic if you could state your name and where you're from, and then address your question. Thank you. If we could deploy a roving mic to the gentleman in the middle there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Musa Shivambu. I'm from Mbeu Insurance. I'm very much excited about the initiative that Africa is taking. I only have one concern though, and I would like to ask the leadership there that, in Africa, we consume what we don't produce, and we produce what we don't consume. How do we then correctly address that issue? And another thing is that such initiatives, according to me as a young entrepreneur, they don't really dwell down into the details of how. I hear you talk about a lot of numbers, the trillion funds there, all of this.
Trillion rand. We must make sure we've got that on point.
Exactly.
Now.
But it doesn't drill down to an individual, to me, on how to access such, right? It's mainly on high level. And such initiatives, I feel like they they don't really include us as the youth, right? And I think we are the future of Africa. Such initiatives should include us as the youth to drive them going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. President Adesina?
Well, thanks very much, Musa. Let me just say that you're not just the future of Africa, you're the present of it. And this initiative, we wanted to make Africa a place the young people want to stay. Look, as president of the African Development Bank, anytime I turn on CNN and I see young people hanging onto rickety boats, trying to get to the Mediterranean Sea, to get to Europe, that's not the kind of Africa we want for our young people. We want an Africa that is growing very fast, fast-paced growth, why not double-digit growth, but with equitable growth, one that is able to create massive amount of jobs for our people. Look, if you take a look at even insects, insects migrate from where it's dark to where there's light, right? And so we want an Africa that has universal access to electricity, where the quality of life is very, very good. Cities like Joburg and others that are very well functioning with water, with sanitation, great infrastructure, ICT facilities, rural areas that have access to infrastructure to turn them from zones of economic misery to zones of economic prosperity. That's the kind of Africa we want. But it requires massive amount of investment in roads, in rails, in port, in aviation, in irrigation, and in financial market development and all of that. So that's what we're really talking about. You know, we're trying to develop a new kind of Africa that we want to be very proud of, not one where people move away from, one where people move to. So that's why the quantum numbers of amount we want to go, it's actually there. But on the young people, we at the African Development Bank, you know, we are investing massively. We have a program ourselves that's called Jobs for Africa's Youth. And that program is to help African countries to create 25 million jobs in the next 10 years and to impact 50 million people as well. You know, and we have a fund that we actually just set up with the European Union, which is a $200 million fund, which is called Boost Africa, which is supposed to support businesses like young people like yourself, early stage businesses that are high risk businesses. We at the bank have another program that's called the Enable Youth. You know, as you know, I was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, and I was a minister that wear bow ties all the time for agriculture, because I think agriculture is sexy, it's cool, it's the coolest business that you can have. The size of that business is going to be $1 trillion by 2030, food industry alone. And so we want young people that are dynamic, entrepreneurial, get into that sector. Yesterday, I had a fantastic discussion with the Premier and also with the commissioner in the provincial council, in the Gauteng province, about how we're going to bring exciting things for young people. You know, the future of agriculture, for example, you're not going to be looking at a farmer that is probably holding some hoe and cutlass. You're going to be looking at young people like yourself with applications, no jumpers, or probably working on your tools with your apps to make agriculture cool and sexy. That's what we want. So take this as a way in which we are trying to make Africa a cool place for investors to say. And that confidence is very important for the continent.
And Premier, just to add, the youth very much at the center of the growth in the Gauteng province, especially entrepreneurship, as referred to in the question.
Yes, Bronwyn, thank you very much for that. Musa, you would know that the youth is very much at the center of the agenda of our provincial government. We have a program called Tsepo 1 Million, which focuses on how to integrate young people into the economy, whether jobs or as entrepreneurs. And I think for the conference, for the forum that we're talking about, the youth should be at the center of the Africa Investment Forum, because Africa's greatest wealth is its youth. Dynamic, energetic, coming from any part of the continent, moving from places where there's nothing, in search of opportunities where there's something. And the African youth is something that, as a continent, the first thing we really need to invest in is to invest in our youth. Because if they are not having education first and foremost, they can become a major risk rather than our wealth. And so I certainly agree with you that we need to be very, very concrete as we prepare for the forum to look at in this platform. So what are the instruments, given the obstacles often young people as young entrepreneurs face, what are the obstacles that are there in the investment space, and how do we unlock opportunities for them? So certainly young people, there can be no Africa today without the youth. The very conceptual understanding of Africa is the most youthful place on earth. So if you take out the youth, you have no Africa to talk about.
So
not even the future. Not even the future. As the president says, the present, Africa as we have it, is the most youthful continent, and we can't change the well-being of people if we don't touch the youth. So that's why we're doing quite a lot in this area of youth development and unlocking opportunities.
While delegates were afforded an opportunity to network here, CNBC Africa caught up with some of the stakeholders to get insight on how the Africa Investment Forum will grow the continent's economy.
Basically, the bank will partner not only the African governments, but also the other development finance partners, development finance institutions, including, let's say, the World Bank, the EBRD, the IFC, the European Investment Bank, and Islamic Development Bank, for example, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, but also, more importantly as well, the private sector. And when we say the private sector, it's not only pension funds, institutional investors, but also private equity funds, developers, and strategic investors.
And I understand that you're championing the energy sector of the African Development Bank.
Absolutely.
But where will the African Development Bank be looking to seek investors?
You know, the African Development Bank and its partners, so remember this is a platform, will be seeking to attract investors not only within the continent, so that should be our first port of call, but also internationally. And within Africa, the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds of Africa are also washed of money. They have trillions of dollars. Last year, for example, the assets under management of all our pension and sovereign wealth funds in Africa stood at about $1.2 trillion. And by 2020, it will reach $1.8 trillion. But a lot of those funds, or assets, are invested in bonds issued by foreign governments, or sometimes African governments as well, and are invested in listed companies, for example. We want a part of that pot of money to be invested in African projects, both infrastructure projects, in the agriculture, in industries, in various sectors in Africa. But of course, we cannot develop Africa and meet the Sustainable Development Goals with only African money, even if we have trillions. We need to attract foreign investors, including the pension funds, global pension funds, global sovereign wealth funds. For example, global assets under management by pension funds, commercial banks, sovereign wealth funds is in excess of $100 trillion, growing roughly 5% per year. So that is also where we need to tap into.
And then and these investments coming into the energy sector, will they be squarely focusing on renewable energies?
Not necessarily on renewable energies. The bank lately, over the last 5 years, has had a focus on renewable energy, investing massively. Last year, for example, 100%, our generation portfolio, 100% was renewable energy. On average, over the last 5 years, I would say 80% of the bank's generation investment were into renewable energies. But it does not mean that we are focused on renewable energy, because we recognize, and in the same way the Paris Agreement recognizes as well, the fact that the energy transition will take time. It's not just overnight that we will switch and become all, I would say, using only renewable energies. It will take a time, so the bank will continue to also invest in fossil fuel, in particular gas to power, for example, because Africa has a lot of gas, so that gas can be utilized to develop the power sector. And more importantly, the base load, which you need to industrialize. So far, fossil fuels have played a key role, but also hydro also has played a key role. So going forward, we'll be fast-tracking our investments in renewable energy, while recognizing also that fossil fuel is extremely important, in particular gas.
And then just looking back for a bit, what have been the major challenges in bringing in investments thus far?
You know, a lot of challenges because, first of all, in many countries, the regulatory environment is not really suitable yet. A lot of work has to be done on that front. And the bank has been supporting countries as well to reform by providing concessional money, by providing grant money from trust funds. But also you have technical challenges as well within the utilities themselves. A lot of technical losses, but also financial challenges. A lot of the utilities in Africa are not credit worthy. A recent study has showed that in 39 sub-Saharan countries, only 2 utilities are really financially viable out of 39. And 19 out of them, for example, are not meeting their OPEX cost, through the revenue that they're generating. So utilities transformation, utilities reform to make them bankable, to make sure that they are run like private enterprise, even if they are mostly in majority owned by governments in Africa. You can be owned by a government, but run purely like a commercial and private enterprise that's charging tariffs that are cost reflective. That is one of the biggest issues. Often utilities buy the power at a certain cost, but the cost they're selling the power at is less, for example. And if you add all the operating expenses and other losses, then obviously at the end of the year they will not make money, which means that for them to buy power from private investors, they need the support from the government. And since the governments also are often very weak, those governments need support from the African Development Bank or from the World Bank, from MIGA or from other development partners. And what we want to do through this forum is to make sure that at the end of the day, for identified sectors, for example, or projects, you have a sort of compact between the governments, the private sector, and us, the development finance community, to see how we can each play our role, bring our sort of tools to make sure that projects XYZ or sector XYZ moves forward and attracts more investors.
Now, the African continent in general has a huge shortfall, if I can call it that, in the energy sector, with South Africa providing almost around half of the entire continent's energy.
Sure.
Now, going forward, what will be the African Bank doing to ensure that other countries play a bigger role in providing the energy generation of the continent?
You know, the bank's participation or involvement and the bank and its partners, right? We are not working alone. We always work in partnership with others because the need is so big, but we need to coordinate our partnership. We intervene, let's say, on the generation. But very importantly, we intervene also in transmission, in particular, interconnection between countries or between regions. That's why in the past, the bank has financed many international, I would say, transmission lines. Let's say Zizabona, for example. We are working on that one where we are doing the connection between Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia, for example. If we look at Central Africa, last year, we funded the interconnection between Chad and Cameroon, for example. We have funded also the North Cove interconnection between Niger, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and so on and so forth. The idea here is to create power pools, to develop the power pools so that Cote d'Ivoire could sell its power, let's say, or as far as to Nigeria, you know.
Now, there's also the DRC's Grand Igna Dam, which is, of course, seen as one of the tools that could alleviate the continent's energy burdens. How is the AFDB planning on tapping into the Grand Igna Dam?
Yeah, the African Development Bank has been a long-term partner of the DRC in trying to develop INGA since the 90s. We financed the rehabilitation, for example, of INGA 1. We provided grant money for feasibility studies also in the 90s. And in 2013, the bank provided almost $70 million to develop INGA 3. And INGA 3 has the objective to sort of produce 4,800 megawatts, and 2,500 megawatts out of that should be sent to South Africa. Some agreement had been already signed between the government of DRC and South Africa so that Eskom can be one of the off-takers of that power, and that would help the project even be more bankable. We are advancing our work with the government. We hired many consultants, financial advisors, technical, legal advisors to help the government source private capital to help develop that Inga 3.
10 years ago, when we talked about the continent, people forget very quickly. We were talking about just corruption, we're talking about famine, we're talking about... At least now we can talk about actual projects. We can talk about, deals being done. We can talk about 30-year projects being put together. And that's what this, I think, just adds to that narrative that, look, this is an ongoing journey. And then as we go along and as we become better at this thing, as Africa starts sort of like, taking its own, destiny into its own hands, then, we start doing things better and better. And I believe it's just a continuing momentum that needs to be built upon. And at least, we are now getting there. And this should be able to do that Africans start, trading with each other, they start dealing with each other, and they sort of like start doing things for their own benefit, and they start believing and investing in themselves. And I think for me that's the biggest sort of like joy I get out of this, that Africans can start believing and doing things for themselves. When we started 10 years ago and we said Africans must invest in their own infrastructure, it was said no, there's not enough projects on the continent to do that. We know that today it's a very different story.
Africans doing things for Africans. Clearly you've been big on investments over the years, but what is your specific involvement with the African Investment Forum and the African Development Bank?
Yeah, I think first of all, with the African Development Bank, when we initially started, Harith, and we started like the Pan-African Infrastructure Development Fund, it was also the African Development Bank which took us across the continent in some of their key partners, which are capital pools, to say, let us start supporting this initiative to start investing in ourselves. At that stage, you were not finding African capital or African savings investing in themselves. And out of that pool, African Development Bank came into the fund, it supported us, and it not only supported us, it also co-funded with us in some projects. And also in addition to that, it also opened up some capital pools across the continent. We have now, over the past 10 years now, actually got now in excess of $1 billion over the two funds now, raised. And we've now have funds in Ghana which have invested in us. We've got funds in Nigeria which have invested in our funds, and we've got Botswana funds which have invested in our funds. So this, as I say, it's a continuing thing. And that's how I see, the support of African Development Bank has been to us. And to the extent of now creating that platform, which then sort of creates more connectivity between African businesses, between businesses and capital. That's what we sort of are very much supportive of in terms of what African infrastructure forum is going to be about, or the creation of that marketplace. And I think our involvement with also, you must know, as an entity that is based out of South Africa, we've also had some very good exposures to South Africa. We have an investment in a form of with some of our partners in Lanseria, and out of which we've had some significant support coming out of the Gauteng government, promoting and supporting those special economic zones. So when all these entities come together, we see this as a continuation of that sort of it's like a connectivity of things. It works like the internet. Bring all these things which connect to each other, to work with each other and make things happen. Just for the, and we're not waiting for tomorrow. We now started to get things done. And that's what, I think our involvement with, that's our history with both sort of institutions.
Doing it ourselves. That's the basic message that I'm getting for you. But November, it is of course will be taking place, African Investment Forum. Do you have specific targets set in place for that?
Africa. Look, I think what we more than anything looking forward to is to make more of those connections and make, and also start looking at like what, we have now created, as Harold, an integrated power company, which is called Energy. And we then look at like, what other businesses within the space are operating within within the continent that we could partner up with, that we could do things with, that we could invest in to sort of like, grow and promote the whole issue of creating this integrated, power and energy company. In addition to that, we're also looking very aggressively at like, what are some of the transport initiatives or companies which are out there which are looking to take whatever they're doing anywhere and combine with other similar sort of like operations across the continent to then start growing that narrative. And we basically operate on that net. It's like, we do things, and I can assure you in the next 3, 5, 10 years, out of these initiatives, you start seeing companies which then start taking on, making a difference in the continent. We saw it with our power companies, and we're seeing how then do we take that to not only start being continental companies, but starting also from there, in the next 10 years, we're no longer maybe just going to be continental African companies, but maybe global entities. We should be able to compete with anything and anybody anywhere. Because if we don't, stronger sort of balance sheets and stronger entities are going to come here and have our breakfast. And we should sort of ensure that we have institutions and companies which here can do that. And partnering up with all sorts of entities which are doing similar things across the country is important. That aggregation by Africans is also important, and that's what we're looking forward to.
Those were the highlights from the launch of the African Development Bank's Investment Forum. One of Africa's leading economies, South Africa's Gauteng province, will host the Africa Investment Forum from the 7th till the 9th of November. CNBC Africa will bring you all the action as it happens.